Well, Christmas time seems like a good time to have a party, and so maybe you and your family have decided to have a party. And there's always the challenges that come with the party. You have to decide on the food, and you have to decide on like decorations, and maybe you're going to play games or have some type of activity going on, like building a gingerbread house or something like that. Those decisions have to be made, but really the biggest decision is who are you going to invite to this party? And so you could kind of sit down and, like husband and wife maybe, or individually, it doesn't matter, but you're like, okay, who can we invite? And should we invite this person here? Okay, that would be a good person. But then we look at the next one. Do they know this person? And do they get along? And does this person know anybody? And what's the conversation going to be like? And do we have enough extroverts coming? Or is this all introverts? Or are we just going to be sitting around looking at each other? And it gets to be a little bit of a challenge, but eventually you figure it out, I think. Like if we're going to have a Christmas party, we got to get the right people to the Christmas party, and we get them invited. That's a contrast, though, to the family Christmas party, because the guest list is already decided. And that means that everybody's invited, everybody that even you wish weren't necessarily coming to the party. Like Aunt Ethel, who's the worst gossip ever, she's going to be there, and Grandpa, who's certainly going to say something that's wildly inappropriate, and, it's just kind of like wondering when that's going to come out, or those two cousins who haven't talked to each other in 20 years, or Gladys, who's always been in a bad mood, or Uncle Jed, nobody even knows how he's related, but he always comes looking for an argument, and we get to the family party a little bit like, oh, I don't know if I want to go, because we don't like who's invited. Well, Matthew in his gospel includes a guest list of sorts for that first Christmas. And yes, everybody's invited. And if we're completely honest, we might look at that list and go, oh, I don't know if we want everybody to show up here. Because there's some pretty unlikely names on that list, including the one that we're going to look at today. Actually, the person we want to talk about today's name is not on the list, but she's mentioned and it's very clear who she is. So let's take out our Bibles if you want, if you got tablets or phones, whatever. We're going to read from Matthew chapter 1, and then we're going to go to 2 Samuel in just a little bit here. But if you came this morning, let me just say this while you're turning. If you came this morning for a happy, breezy, light Christmas message, that's not where we're going to go today. Instead, we're going to be looking at a story that's a little bit difficult, and to be completely honest, it's a little bit uncomfortable. And it may be even that way more for some of you than for others, but I want to say up front, okay? I'm aware of that. I want to be super sensitive to the situation, to the story here. My goal is not in any way to be disruptive. My intent this morning is to be helpful and to be hopeful, but to actually go where the scripture takes us here this morning and to look at a story. The genealogy, Matthew chapter 1, the Christmas list. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And we talked about her now 3 weeks ago. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. We talked about her a couple weeks ago. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, and we talked about her last week. Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. So her name's not giving, but we know that Matthew is talking about Bathsheba here, and she's actually the fourth woman that is mentioned in this genealogy of Matthew. And you keep reading down there to verse number 16. It says, Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So if you ever wondered, why did Matthew include this list in his gospel, in his story? And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's to show that Jesus was technically in line to be the Messiah, but kind of. See, this is actually Joseph's lineage here, and Joseph was not the father of Jesus, but legally he would have been seen as the father of Jesus, and Jesus in that way was then in line legally to be the king, coming through the line of Joseph, and legally he would be qualified to be the Messiah. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons why Matthew does that. But there's another reason I think that's even more important. It's because this list sets up the Christmas story. And what Matthew is trying to do here is say, read this and understand who's in this list. And to the Jews that read this, those names would have been way more familiar than they are to us. But he's saying this list is necessary if you're going to understand the Christmas story. And for several reasons here. First of all, the Christmas story then is rooted in historical fact. And by giving this genealogy, Matthew is saying this actually happened. This is not a fable or once upon a time in a kingdom far, far away. He's saying you can go back to the historical record and you can actually prove that this story, that there were these people and that it happened. And so it's a historical record. It's not some fable designed to teach a moral truth or to inspire. They're real characters. They're not fictional. Secondly, this Christmas story is about God keeping his promises. It starts with Abraham, and God promised Abraham what? You're going to be the father of a great nation, and through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. Who's he talking about? Jesus Christ. And then Matthew traces it through David, and David was the one who was promised, on your throne the Messiah is going to sit. And so this is just proof again that God, in the Christmas story, God is about keeping his promises. Thirdly, it tells us that the Christmas story is for everyone, and everyone is invited, including the outsider, like the gender outsider, like Tamar or Ruth or Rahab or Bathsheba, like the racial outsider, they would qualify again, like the moral outsider, like the economic outsider, like the political outsider, like the person who's been traumatized, like the underdog, the questionable, the unlikely. Everybody is invited because everybody needs the message of Christmas. And so we've been focusing on these 4 women who are definitely outsiders. And we've been looking at their stories as we've gone through this. And we come today to the wife of Uriah, is that's how she's listed there. And I think there's a reason for that we'll get to in a little bit here. We know as Bathsheba, and probably a majority of you are familiar with the story of David and Bathsheba. It's recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, and we're going to look at that in just a little bit here. If you want to follow along in the Bible that's right there in the rack, it's on page 221, and that might be a great way to look at this. We're going to read some parts of the story, I'll tell you some parts, and we're going to highlight some things as we go. But most of us, I think, are somewhat familiar to this story. And I was trying to think back, when was the first time I actually heard this story? I'm guessing I was in Sunday school, though I'm sure it was cleaned up and sanitized in some way. It went something along the lines of David was, out on the roof, and he looked over on another roof, and there was a woman taking a bath there, and he wanted her and whatever, and they got together, and I'm like, I'm just feeling for the Sunday school teacher who got the curriculum that week, going, oh, good, how do I talk about this one? And that's probably the first time I heard that story. But then by the time I got to middle school, high school, and youth group, we were able to talk a little bit more about the details of the story because we had, gotten to that point. And it was something along the lines of this, Bathsheba was out there taking a bath. And for whatever reason, I always had this picture in my mind that she was on her roof taking a bath, which is just weird. And I don't know where that came from, but she's taking a bath there, and she knows that David's going to be out on the roof, and so she's trying to tempt and get David's attention, and sure enough, that works, and she seduces him, and David falls because he's weak, and he goes and gets her, and they come and they have their affair, and she gets pregnant, and then after that, they got to get rid of Bathsheba's husband, and the whole story there. And when I heard that in youth group, it was always like, okay, girls, you got to be modest. You got to be careful that you're not causing somebody unnecessary temptation. And guys, even if they do that, you got to just look the other way and you got to be strong. And I think that's just not a very good rendering of that story or the lessons of that story. Not to say that those lessons may or may not be applicable, but as an adult, I think maybe we need to take another look at this story because I'm not sure we're getting it right. I'm just going to give us a different perspective. I've tried to think if I've ever, taught on this story before. I'm not sure, probably. But as I really have dived into this story this week, it's like, I got to think about that. And as I look at this list of women here in the genealogy of Christ, it gives me a different perspective. And so I want to explore it again and raise some other possibilities, things that I think personally are likelihoods, and I could be wrong. So you can judge that as we go, whether you think I'm getting this right or not. But there are some things in this story that we really need to consider. So 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse number 1, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. And it's pretty much of universal opinion that David was not where he should have been. He should have been off to war, but he was being lazy, or maybe he was just too much about himself. But he was at home and taking it easy. And it's kind of scary because there's this fact that he was willing for others to put themselves on the line physically, literally their lives on the line. Well, he just sat around and wasn't doing a whole lot of anything. But one evening, it tells us in verse number 2, David got up from his bed and walked around the roof of the palace. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing. Let's think about this for a minute. This first picture is like, okay, we've got this woman in this bubble bath or something else like that. There's only one problem with that is they probably didn't have bathtubs, if you want to go back into the Bible times. And the other thing, too, is, this is Israel. Like modesty and propriety would have been a big deal. So whatever situation she was bathing in, it probably would have been pretty private, because that would have just been the expected of the day there. There would not have been any running water, so she's not soaking somewhere. What she's probably doing is giving herself somewhat of a sponge bath is what's going on here. And it even tells us why she's bathing in verse number 4. It's a ceremonial cleansing that was to be observed at the end of a menstrual period. So she was actually following her religious and spiritual obligations. And so this picture we get of Bathsheba sometimes maybe skewered a little bit. She might have been doing just what she was supposed to be doing, having no idea whatsoever that she could be seen. There's no indication of that in the story. Well, it goes on here. End of verse 2, the woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. So the man goes, ask about it. The man said, comes back, reports to David, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So first of all, notice this, David has no idea who she is. There's no personal connection. There's no relationship, friendship, anything of any kind. That's why he's asking about her. And then check out the response that he gets. And by the way, David at this time already has 7 wives and a harem. So he's used his role and his privilege in his role, I think, for a lot of personal gratification. And he seems to have a hard time telling himself no. But anyhow, they come back. The messenger comes back and said, this is Bathsheba. What is he saying? This woman, David, has a name. She's not a piece of property. She's not an object. She is a person, a real person who has a name, who has a heart, who has a life of her own. She's not just an object of your desire. And then he goes on and says what? Her father's name is Eliam. Not only is she a person, she's somebody's daughter. And she needs to be treated with the same respect and care that your daughter should be treated with. Not only is she somebody's daughter, but her father, Eliam, he's one of your 30 best men. You know her father, David. He's with you. He's on your side. He's fought with you. In fact, you even know her grandfather, who has been an advisor to you. And then he goes on and says, her husband's name is Uriah. So she has a name. She's somebody's daughter. She's also somebody's wife. She's married, David. She belongs to somebody else. She's not available. And she's married to a guy named Uriah. Oh, by the way, David, you know him too, because he's part of those 30 men that are your most trusted fighters and supporters. And so the response that comes back to David is basically this guy saying, whoa, stop, David. What you're thinking here is stupid and wrong, and don't go there. Then David sent messengers to get her, and he runs right through, not just a stop sign, but like a wall. So the messengers show up at her door, plural messengers from the king. Why would they be coming to her door? What do you think she's thinking? Well, her husband's off to war. So is her father, by the way. And maybe they're coming with some bad news and the king wants to tell her personally. She doesn't know. It doesn't tell us in the text. But she gets taken to the king. I don't think she really, even if she had an inkling of what's going on, she doesn't really have any power to say no. They were sent to get her, and so she arrives there. And besides, the king has a reputation, right? He's a man after God's own heart. He's a religious leader, not just a political leader there in Israel. Asaph referred to him in Psalm 78 as the shepherd of Israel. She could trust him. And so she comes, and it says she came to him, and he slept with her. Not they slept together. It says he slept with her. And then it tells us why she's taken the bath in the first place. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. And then she went back home. So the first time they meet together, they end up bed together. And that seems a little suspect to me. And it seems rather one-sided. And that's a scary, scary thought. I realize we're not told that she tries to resist. Maybe she did, and maybe she didn't. Would anybody have hurt her? What would happen if she had? The king had a lot of power. And even if she was complicit, which I seriously doubt in looking at this story, but even if she was still very much a victim here, because the king had definitely taken advantage of her. And we talk a lot about consent today and these kinds of relationships. I don't think there was a whole lot of consent going on. I could be wrong. This, to me, looks like a power play. A man who has power shows he can't be trusted with us, or with it. And that's actually most of us, because power is a scary thing. And it's a scary thing, too, because David at one point had been a man after God's own heart, and then he becomes a man after his own power. But we live in a world today that's consumed with power. And it's scary what happens to people when people with power don't have any boundaries or don't have any accountability. And we see that not just in the secular world, we see that in the church world too. And if you follow any of the church world, I mean, we've had just a ton of scandals of different religious leaders and pastors and whatever who have, when the story has come out, who have taken advantage of their position and been involved in sexual abuse. And it's a scary thought. And then what does David do? He says, send her home. I'm done with you. And he seems to go on his way, not realizing that her whole world has been changed forever. And it's David's fault 100%. Because he was the one who got this whole thing started and made this decision. So verse number 5, the woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. It's the only word she says in this whole story. And I think at that point, she probably doesn't know what to do. Her husband's not home. He's off fighting in a war. And how would she tell him anyhow? She probably felt like she couldn't tell anybody. And somewhere she managed to get the word back to David, though, that she was pregnant. Not realizing when she did that, she was actually jeopardizing her own husband in that message. But David gets the message, and what does he do? He panics. It's like, oh no. She's pregnant. Uriah wasn't home. It's going to be, she came to the palace that one day. It's going to be obvious what happened here. And so David sets out to cover for himself. And so he calls Uriah in from fighting and says, hey, go home and be with your wife for a little bit. And Uriah's like, I can't do that. Like, I can't go home to her when all of my comrades are out there fighting. And David tries a second time, and Uriah says no. And David doesn't know what to do, and he's really in a panic then. And so he sends word to his general Joab and says, hey, take Uriah and make sure that you get him into battle. And really, you guys are going to storm the castle there is what they're doing. And just make it sure that he's in a place where when there's casualties, he's one of them. Whoa. What has happened to David in this situation? And so that's exactly what happens. And sure enough, Uriah is killed. And it says he was killed along with others. So it's not just Uriah who loses his life here for doing nothing wrong. It's others as well. David's responsible for all of their deaths. And look what he says. In verse number 25, David told the messenger who came back with his news, He says, say this to Joab. Take this news back to Joab. Don't let these losses upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. In other words, that's how it goes in war sometimes. People die. Whoa. And what's sad here is he doesn't want Joab to feel bad about having some losses in the battle. But has he ever stopped to think about maybe Bathsheba and what she's feeling at this point? Verse number 26, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. That to me just doesn't sound like somebody who was out there trying to have a good time with the king. And she gets word that she's lost her husband and she's got this other situation that she's dealing with. And I don't even know if she has any idea that David's responsible for her husband. But it says in verse number 27, after the time of mourning was over, David brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done, not the thing that David and Bathsheba had done, but the thing David had done, displeased the Lord. And then we move over to chapter 12. And somehow, God gets word to the prophet Nathan, who was a religious leader in that day, and said, okay, something's happened here, and you're going to be the one who's going to confront it. And I'm sure Nathan was not excited about that role. But he goes in to talk to David, and he says, David, I got a story to tell you. And here's the story. There's a rich man, and then he's got a neighbor who's poor. And the rich man has all kinds of sheep, and the poor guy, he just has one sheep. And the rich guy has a friend who comes to visit him, and instead of taking one of his sheep and preparing him for food, he goes to his neighbor, and he takes that neighbor's one sheep. And he slaughters that sheep and he offers that for food. And David is immediately enraged. And Nathan points his finger at him and says, that's you, David. That's what you've done. You've taken Uriah's one sheep for yourself when you had the kingdom. And don't miss the role of the lamb in the story either. The lamb's a completely innocent victim who's done in by a greedy man's power. Well, David realizes his sin. He repents. Psalm 51 is a great psalm that he writes that expresses his confession. But the repercussions and the consequences of David's sin were awful. The children he had conceived with his other wives almost uniformly got messed up, did despicable, horrible things. They died horrible deaths. His family life became an absolute nightmare from that point on. The child that he had conceived with Bathsheba is born, but then dies shortly thereafter. And I can only imagine the grief that Bathsheba is dealing with. First, she's lost her husband. She's lost her home. Now she's lost a child. Some of you can probably relate to that. You've lost mates. You've lost other children. And I can't imagine what she's going through at this point in the story. And it tells us then that David comforted his wife by sleeping with her, and I don't even know what to make of that. Who's comforting whom? I don't get it. It just doesn't sound very comforting to me if you're Bathsheba. But anyhow, she gets pregnant again and has a son who's named Solomon. And then she and Solomon just kind of disappear from the rest of David's story until you get to the very end of David's life, which flips us over to 1 Kings chapter 1. And David's on his deathbed. And so the question is, who's going to be the next king? And one of his sons, Adonijah, I believe it was, decides he would like to be the king. And so he gets some people together and supporters together, and he establishes himself as king. And Nathan, the same Nathan who had gone in and confronted David for his sin, gets word of this, and he sends word to Bathsheba and says, hey, you need to know what's going on here. Because didn't David promise Solomon the throne? And so Bathsheba gets her courage together. In 1 Kings 1:15, she went in to see the aged king in his room where Abishag the Shunammite was attending him. Bathsheba bowed down, prostrating herself before the king. What is it that you want? The king asked. She said to him, my lord, you yourself swore to me, your servant, by the Lord your God, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne. But now Adonijah has been king, and you, my lord the king, do not know about it. So she tells David what has happened here. And Nathan, the prophet, shows up to corroborate a story there. And David says, okay, you're right, I promised that. And which is weird here because we're never told in Scripture that he did, but evidently he did because he never contradicts her. And David makes Solomon the king. But I love this part of the story because I feel like Bathsheba has just taken blow after blow after blow. And she's about to take one more in the fact that, her son Solomon, who's supposed to be king, isn't going to become king. And she finally says, you know what? I'm going in there. And she goes in and she stands up for her son, and she stands up for justice, and she stands up for what's right. And she has the courage to fight for her son who becomes the next king and who is part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. And her name gets included in this lineage as Solomon's mother, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And I'll tell you why I think it's said that way. It's because I think she gets to keep the honor of her husband's name. And he was an honorable man. So there's some key takeaways from this story. I think there's really a lot to look at David, and that's our tendency to look at David, all his failures, his lack of self-control, his abuse of power, his thinking he could cover it all up, his disregard for the lives of others, his total and reckless selfishness. Lots of lessons on what not to do. But this genealogy in Matthew is written in such a way that it doesn't give the attention to David. It gives the attention to Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, a woman. She might have been a Hittite herself. We don't know. She's involved in this kind of significant sin, although I would think probably unwillingly. We don't know for sure. But she's certainly suffered some extreme trauma from being possibly assaulted, to the loss of her husband, to the loss of her home, to the loss of a child, to being an underdog in the story. And once again, just like the other women we've looked at here, she's just fierce because she gets to a point where she says, this is enough. And she steps in and argues for her son. And so what I want to do this morning as we wrap up is I want to conclude with what we learned from her story, not from David. And also, though, but what not to do. The first thing is this: don't accept the blame or the shame for something that has been done to you. Don't accept the blame or the shame for something that has been done for you, especially if you've been taken advantage, and maybe even in this realm, where somebody has been physically or sexually abusive of you. And this could be men, could be women, and we see this so often in our world. And I realize that this is uncomfortable this morning, but I also know that it's reality, so I want to say to you, please, 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 don't accept the blame or the shame for what's been done to you. Don't accept responsibility for somebody else's sinful behavior. Even if you might feel like somehow you went along here, never in this story ever did we see Bathsheba blamed for any sin in the story. Secondly, don't accept the temptation to minimize your mourning. It's more than okay if you grieve your losses. If maybe you've been in a situation like this where you've taken some personal losses, it's okay. And we have to deal with some stuff emotionally. And I grew up in a church or system, whatever you want to say, where it was always like, well, okay, we just have to put the past behind us and trust God and just believe that God's using all this together for good. And we were like emotionally tuned out, and it's not okay. You see, you've been through something and you felt the emotion of that. That is okay. You are allowed to grieve. Now, it can't become self-pity. It can't turn into bitterness. But you can't just shut down emotionally and just say, well, I'm just going to have to be tough and shoulder my way through it. You're going to have to deal with things. And grief is an appropriate step in the process. And so give yourself permission to grieve or to mourn. Thirdly, don't accept aloneness in your trauma. And this is one of the things that happens, I think, with a lot of people when something has happened to them is they can't tell anybody. Because they're maybe afraid that they won't be believed, or maybe they'll be assumed that they were complicit in whatever would happened. And so they just kind of suffer by themselves. There's just something in this story that I love here. It's at the end of the story when Bathsheba doesn't even know what's going on with Adonijah. Who steps into the story? Nathan. And you get the impression that somewhere in this story all along, Nathan has been maybe like a spiritual advisor to her, at least a friend to her, a person who steps into her story and says, here, let me help you. And sometimes, like, I can't share with what's going on, I don't want to dump that on people, whatever it is. You need to speak up, because you don't need to go through this by yourself. And sometimes even speaking up will give you the opportunity and the agency to maybe share somebody else who needs to hear your story too. Fourthly, don't accept the lie that what has happened to you defines you or defines your character. You are not what's happened to you. Your character is who you are. It's not something that somebody else has done in your story. And this is kind of cool. If you get to the end of the book of Proverbs, that's written by Solomon, Bathsheba's son. And it starts out in Proverbs chapter 1, whatever the Proverbs that Lemuel gave, or that Lemuel's mother gave to him. Lemuel, we believe, was another name for Solomon. And so these are the things that Solomon's mother taught him. And if you keep reading through Psalm 31, Proverbs 31, what do you get to? The description of the noble woman. And this is either Bathsheba saying here, this is what I believe a noble woman is. Look at the character that's found in that list. Or it may even be Solomon looking at his mother and saying, this is what I see here. And I love that part of the story here, is that Bathsheba wasn't about this event in her life. Bathsheba was about the person that she was. And that's true for all of us. Whether something's happened to us or whether we've even been part of something, but we could step back and say, I can still have character in my life. Fifthly, don't accept injustice when you have the means to address it. And if you've had something like this happen to you, you have experienced an extreme injustice. Let's just call it what it is. But use that as an opportunity, use your knowledge somehow to help those who may be facing injustice of their own. And that was about to happen to Solomon. He was about to be the victim of more injustice. But in that Proverbs chapter 31, there's an interesting verse. Do we have that? Proverbs chapter 31. Verse number 8 says this. I'll read it for you. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. This is Bathsheba talking to her son Solomon, who's about to become king, or is king at that point, we don't know. But he says, hey, be about justice. Don't be about power. Be about the little person. Be about the person who can't defend themselves. Speak up for them. Judge that person fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. Next, don't accept your past as your destiny. You can't change the past. You can't maybe even make anything better, but you can move past it. And I love the contribution that Bathsheba makes to the kingdom. She raises this son who's known as the wisest ever, who the kingdom at that time was at its greatest ever. She even contributes to the scriptures, and I love how the fact that she moves past that. And then lastly here, don't accept a lesser view of yourself than what God has. Jesus is proudly linked with Uriah's wife. She's invited to the party. And this is the message of Christmas. That Jesus is about all those who suffer injustice, those who have been mistreated, denigrated, kicked to the curb. Christmas is about the childless widow trying to brave a new life in a foreign country, or the voiceless victim who's been taken advantage of and unable to tell her side of the story. That especially these have been invited to the party. But also the forgotten, the abandoned, the forsaken, the misrepresented, the alienated, the insignificant, the poor, the looked down on, all of us. We have been invited to the party, and this is the fourth reason that I believe that this genealogy is put here with the Christmas story is this: the Christmas story is all about grace. The Christmas story is all about grace. There's not one person on this list, this genealogy, who's perfect. There's actually not one person on this genealogy who's deserving. Male, female, Jew, Gentile, some who were obviously immoral, other people who had other things going on. All of them were sinners. Some of them were worse than others. David's actually included in this list too, but they're all included. Why? Because Christmas is about grace. It's not about who we are or what we've done. It's about Jesus Christ, who he is, what he's done, and what he's done for us. And he invites us all. So maybe I think this is kind of an odd message for Christmas, and I agree. But I hope it's helpful, and I hope it's hopeful. We've addressed the reality of hurt. And the truth is that in a room this size of this many people sitting here, I know this is probably cutting too close for some. But I hope that you find healing in your hurt. And I hope that Christmas is a time that doesn't emphasize the hurt, but it's a time that actually brings healing to your hurt. When Jesus shows up and says, "Oh, I want you at my party. I want you at Christmas." So why were all these women included? I think for many reasons, but the reality is that Jesus knew their stories, and he wanted their stories included in his story. But the good news is that he knows your story and he knows my story. He knows all of our stories too, and he wants those stories included in Christmas as well. And that's what Christmas is all about. Let's pray. So Jesus, thank you for grace. Thank you for the truth that whatever we've done, whatever's been done for us, it doesn't stop you. In fact, it calls to you. It invites you. And you invite us. So let's just pause for a moment here for reflection. Maybe you've come this morning, you don't have a relationship with this Jesus who wants to bring healing, who wants to make your story better. You can invite him into your life. Jesus came at Christmas for you, died on a cross, rose again, lives forever today, but you can have a personal relationship with him by inviting him into your story, into your life, to forgive your sin, to become the Savior, as he's called. But if you're a Christ follower this morning, may you be reminded of the fact that Christmas is about bringing healing. That Christmas is about Jesus being on your side. That Jesus is for you, that he wants you in his story. And may you find encouragement in that. Maybe there's something even from that list of things that we learn from Bathsheba that can be helpful to you. What can you take and use? And so, Jesus, we come to the manger this morning. We come to the party because we've been invited. That's crazy. But we're so grateful. Amen. Would you stand with me?